Charge!
At a time when war raged across then Britain, now Wales, a young boy known as Arthur would rise to power after his father Uther Pendragon's demise. This would bring about a mighty change in the country. Once, knights and lords would do whatever they wanted simply because they could. Now, under the reign of King Arthur, the rule of right, not might, has changed the way that things are run. Under the reign of King Arthur, knights fight for chivalry and honor simply because it is the right thing to do. King Arthur also brought about another major change. The rules of chivalry are brought about for the first time. This alludes to triumph and tragedy in numerous ways, but most specifically the uniting of Britain and the age of chivalry and the fall of Arthur with the betrayal of his queen Guinevere and his best knight Lancelot.
I found a tutor, a wizard.
Warlock?
Really? Prove it.
So, Merlin is actually a character that predates Arthur. In Welsh legend, he was not connected to Arthur originally. He was a prophet, a madman, a bard, and his name was Myrddin, with a TH sound in the middle of it. And it's not until the 1100s that Arthur and Merlin come together. It's in the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth, where they're first put together as a team. And it's Geoffrey who changes his name from Myrddin to Merlin. And the story about that's kind of funny, because the name Myrddin sounds like a bad word in French. And so he purposely changed it so it didn't sound so negative to his French audience. So he became Merlin in the 1100s, and he suddenly became, Merlin is the one who helps Uther sleep with Igraine and conceive Arthur, and becomes Arthur's tutor later on. In Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin is a minor character, but his legend grows and other people take up his story and start writing poems just about Merlin, all by himself, which is the same pattern that a lot of the characters in the Arthur story take. Once they're introduced in one story, other authors take them up and start writing all kinds of other stories about that character. The same thing is true of Merlin.
Merlin, I want to be a bird.
All right. Per potentia loium converten evium.
Once Arthur pulled the sword from the stone, many people assumed that he simply ascended to the throne and that there was no confrontation. This is only half true. While Arthur did ascend to the throne, there was quite a backlash. Arthur had to fight against lords and barons of the old order to establish his kingdom. Seating at a table meant everything. The seat at the head of a table was generally reserved for kings and those of the most importance. However, to prevent arguments from breaking out among his knights, King Arthur came up with a revolutionary new idea.
There are certain items that we all associate with King Arthur. His sword, the sword and the stone, Excalibur, which are not always the same sword, actually, But the one item that everybody associates with King Arthur is his round table. What's Arthur without his round table, the Knights of the Round Table? Well, a lot of people are surprised to learn that the Round Table doesn't come into the story until about the year 1200. And it's a man named Was. He's a French writer who's writing the story in Old French for a French audience, who includes the story of the Round Table, and he writes this: Arthur made the Round Table, so reputed of the Britons. This Round Table was ordained of Arthur, that when his fair fellowship sat to meat, their chairs should be high alike, their service equal, and none before or after his comrade. So that's the first mention of the Round Table. And it has to be understood that this was the culture of the chivalric culture of high medieval knighthood. It's the culture that surrounded Was in the 12th and 13th century, but it is not the culture that surrounded the historical Arthur in the 6th century. The Round Table is a product of much later centuries. And so we see this meshing together of historical events from the 6th century, but the culture of the 13th century in a lot of these stories of the Arthurian legend. One other thing, let me say one more thing about the Round Table. So the Round Table also represents a really important part of the culture of knighthood, and that is that knights at this time began to enter into fraternities or brotherhoods, much like a monastic or a religious brotherhood where monks would all live together and live by a certain discipline. Knights also would take sworn oaths to live by a certain discipline, to uphold a certain code of honor, and they would join a brotherhood, and they were all equal brother in arms. And so the Knights of the Round Table represent that high medieval chivalric ideal of living in a brotherhood of arms, a knightly order in which everybody had to live by the same rules and everybody was seen as an equal. So that egalitarian ideal that we see in Arthur is, once again, it's a product of the 13th century rather than the 6th century when Arthur supposedly lived.
With the introduction of the Round Table, the idea of equality among fellow knights was introduced as well. Before the reign of King Arthur, lords and kings did as they pleased, simply because they could. They gave no thought for those who weren't knights. And to them, war was a game. When Arthur came to power, he changed the way things were run. To quote T.H. White's The Once and Future King,
"You see, might is not right, but there's a lot of might knocking about in this world, and something has to be done about it. It is as if people in this world were half horrible and half nice. Perhaps they are even more than half horrible, and when they are left to themselves, they run wild. You get the average baron that we see nowadays. People like Sir Bruce Sands-Petty, who simply go around cloud-hopping around the country dressed in steel, and doing exactly what they please, for sport. It is our Norman idea about the upper classes having a monopoly of power, without references to justice. Then, the horrible side gets the uppermost, and there is thieving, and rape, and plunder, and torture. The people become beasts. Now, what I have thought is this. Why can't you harness might so that it works for right? The might is there, in the half-bad people, and you can't neglect it. You can't cut it out, but you might be able to direct, so that it may be useful instead of bad. My idea is that if we can win this battle in the front of us, and get the firm holding of this country, then we'll institute a sort of order of cavalry. I will not punish the bad knights, or hang Lot, but I will try to get them into order. We shall have to make it a great honor, and make it fashionable, and all that, and that I shall make it the oath of order that might is only used for the right.
The term might versus right has a long, long history. People have found this idea in ancient Greek manuscripts, ancient Greek philosophers. But the phrase itself, might versus right, was never used until the 1800s as such in English. Famously, Abraham Lincoln uses it in reverse, as he says that we must hope that right can make might, speaking of their efforts to end slavery and the Civil War. T.H. White takes up this phrase and uses it frequently in his famous book, The Once and Future King. We have to think about T.H. White in his own historical context, too. He's writing at a time when lots of might was building up in Europe. Between the wars, between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, weapons caches building up all over Europe. Dangerous weapons that have never been thought of by man before. Will this might be used for right? This is his great worry. And the story, The Once and Future King, comes out at a time when Englishmen are extremely worried about what's happening in England, about these possible Germanic invaders. A story about Arthur fighting, using his might for right, really resonates strongly with that generation. And The Once and Future King became an instant classic because it spoke to the worries about
The rules of chivalry: fair play, nobility, valor, honor, courtesy, loyalty. To live one's life so that it is worthy of respect and honor. To never do outrage nor murder. Always to flee treason. Do not commit crimes against your country or king. By no means be cruel. Give mercy unto him who asks for mercy. To always provide succor or help to ladies, gentlewomen, and widows. A knight must promise to help women if they require it. To never force or harm ladies, gentlewomen, or widows. Not to take up battles in wrongful quarrels for love or worldly goods. Do not even join in fights over anything less than God or country. To fear God and maintain his church.
So, King Arthur is very strongly associated with the culture of chivalry that develops in the High Middle Ages, the culture of knighthood. Chivalry that chivalric culture develops over a long period of time. It begins with the warrior ideals of the early Middle Ages. New families come to power in the chaos of the breakdown of the Roman Empire. New warrior elite families come into power, and those who take power are those who can win the day by the strength of their arms. A new value system is put into place, one that values prowess on the battlefield, loyalty to their leader, courage in the face of death, and also largesse, generosity, the generous king, the ring giver, who rewards his men graciously. This becomes the roots of a chivalric culture that is Christianized and becomes the elite culture of the day, so that the king's courts become places where men can go and prove themselves through daring feats in battle and raise their stakes, raise their life, raise their status in the community by doing brave deeds in battle. In the High Middle Ages, there's another facet that's added to that, and that is courtly behavior. The idea that one must carry a certain air, must speak well, must be able to cite poetry, speak well, defend oneself against insults. All of this gets added into this idea of chivalry in the High Middle Ages. And one of the really interesting manifestations of this is that the knight who is a low-level knight can gain status by wooing a woman of higher social status than he is. And to do this, he must prove himself worthy by accomplishing feats of daring and bold behavior, finding some problem and solving it, proving himself a worthy companion to a woman of higher social status than he. This is the roots of the questing knight, the knight errant, the knight out looking for some problem that he can solve, some right or some wrong that he can right. And we see this even early on in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. Geoffrey talks about knights who could not woo a woman until he had proven himself 3 times in battle. And so we see that in the earliest stories of Arthur, we already have embedded in there this chivalric ideal of noble knights trying to prove themselves to high-status women. And that chivalric culture is one that even many future authors still use as this romanticized version of the Middle Ages, that was this beautiful moment when people who had power used it to do what was right, used it to right wrongs. In real life, not all knights behave that way, but in the literature, that was the ideal. That was what the ideal knight was. And that chivalric culture will always be a big part of what Arthur represents.
Sir Gawain was the oldest of 4 Gaelic brothers who joined the Round Table. His most famous fight is his battle with the Green Knight. Sir Gaheris was the second youngest of the 4 Gaelic brothers to join the Round Table. Not much is known about him except for the fact that he ate a poisoned apple intended for his brother Gawain. Sir Gareth was the youngest of the 4 Gaelic brothers who joined the Round Table. His most famous adventure is his battle against the Red Knight. Sir Bors the Younger was the son of Bors the Elder. He was one of the knights to accompany Sir Percival on the quest for the Holy Grail. Sir Percival was renowned for his strength and fighting prowess. He was the second most holy knight after Galahad. Sir Galahad was the son of Lancelot and Elaine, said to be the most pure knight. Sir Galahad went on the quest for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail. It was said that this grail was the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper and to have caught the blood that spilled from Christ's side when pierced at the crucifixion. The grail became a key quest for the knights of the Round Table. Lancelot made an attempt for the grail but failed. The only knight who could retrieve it was the most pure knight, Sir Galahad.
God, that stinks.
Agreed.
After you, my liege. This is, after all, your quest.
All right. I'll go.
Sir Kay was the son of Sir Ector and the foster brother of King Arthur. He was also one of the first knights of the Round Table.
Lancelot, many people are surprised to find, is a latecomer to the Arthurian story. He's not introduced until a French writer named Chrétien du Troyes writes about him. Chrétien was one of the big Arthurian authors. He was really the inventor of the genre Arthurian romance, and he wrote several novels, or several poems, I should say, about various knights of the Round Table. And one of the knights that he invents is Lancelot. And he also invents the idea that Lancelot and Guinevere fall in love with each other and have an affair. So the Lancelot, Arthur, Guinevere triangle is something that comes along quite a bit later, about 100 years after Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's in the 1200s that Chrétien's writing this, and adds that important Lancelot piece. Lancelot, however, after Chrétien, becomes even more popular than Arthur for hundreds of years. People write more literature about Lancelot than they do Arthur himself. He becomes Arthur's most powerful knight, and that Lancelot, Guinevere, Arthur story becomes one of the core pieces that we think of when we think of Arthur. It becomes it's an immediate hit. His books are widely published. People love the story, and it becomes an immediate part of the Arthurian canon.
Sir Lancelot is probably one of the most well-known knights of the Round Table. Lancelot was the first knight of the Round Table. Also known as the Ill-Made Knight, countless stories are told of his quests and heroics. Some of the more famous adventures include the rescue of Elaine.
Help me! Help me! Thank you! Sir...
Lancelot.
There have been a number of historical figures that people have proposed to be the real Arthur, the flesh and blood man around whom all of these stories developed. The most widely accepted one, though, is not a particular person who shows up in any historical record. The most widely accepted idea is that Arthur's stories develop around a strong leader living somewhere in southern Wales or Cornwall who pushed back against Anglo-Saxon invaders and actually won several important battles, and that's where the beginnings of the legend begin. To understand this, we have to understand the historical context in which Arthur supposedly lived. It's a time of great political chaos. In the year 410, the Romans pulled all of their troops, all of their bureaucrats out of England, out of Britannia. It's not England yet. Out of Britannia. They pull all of their troops, all of their bureaucrats, all their political apparatus out of Britannia, and they're never to return.
Fantastic timing.
I'll start again. To understand the historical context of Arthur, we have to understand that it's a time of political chaos. Around the year 410, Romans have pulled all of their troops, all of their bureaucrats, all of their political apparatus out of Britannia, and they're never going to return. And the British people living there try their best to maintain order, maintain civility, but there's lots of pressure. There's Picts coming in from Ireland. There are Scots coming in from Ireland. There are also invaders coming in from the continent. Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, many groups are all coming in and invading, trying to take land, trying to settle, and lots of conflict. Around the year 500 or so, the advancement of Anglo-Saxons west across Britannia is halted and pushed back for a generation or two. And it's in that particular time frame that we believe the historical Arthur actually lived. And there's some really fascinating pieces of evidence that we have for that. One of the real fascinating pieces that we have is an ancient hill fort that for time immemorial has been called Camelot. It's known today better as Cadbury Hill. But on top of Cadbury Hill was an ancient hill fort, an Iron Age hill fort, that once the Romans invaded Britannia, was abandoned. But after Rome leaves Britain in the year 500 or so, that hill fort is reoccupied, refortified, and becomes a major base of operations for someone who we don't know. We don't have any names written down. He doesn't show up in history, but people have speculated that maybe that was home base for whoever the Arthur stories have been built around. We know for certain that some strong leader lived in around that time and was able to win some battles against the Anglo-Saxons. And that's really the seed of the story of Arthur. That's the beginning of the story. From Gildas, who was writing at the same time that Arthur lived, to Nennius and the Welsh legends that grow up before Geoffrey of Monmouth. The real story is about a leader, not necessarily a king, but a leader who won battles against the Anglo-Saxons and brought peace for a generation. And from there the story becomes a literary phenomenon, and all of the things that we think about Arthur are a literary phenomenon built around that kernel, that kernel of historical truth, that one leader defeated the Anglo-Saxons for a time.
My queen.
Lancelot, you're back!
I've been foolish, Jenny.
Whatever do you mean?
I've been foolish with my feelings. Who I am. You.
Oh, Lancelot!
Jenny.
From the beginnings of the Arthur story, disunity is the source of Arthur's downfall. His kingdom is divided, and in the earliest stories, it's his nephew Mordred who divides the kingdom, who tries to usurp the throne while Arthur's away fighting battles. After Chrétien de Troyes invents the Lancelot story, it becomes the new story that it's that love triangle that creates the seeds of disunity. And as it becomes known that Lancelot is having an affair with Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table divide their loyalties between Arthur and Lancelot, and this becomes the dividing line that causes the disunity that is the downfall of Arthur's empire. That is the source of the battle where all the Knights of the Round Table die, everybody except for Bedivere. And so that new story becomes the seed of disunity that is the downfall of Arthur.
Mordred was the illegitimate son of King Arthur and his half-sister Morgase. He was conceived after Morgase placed an enchantment on Arthur. When King Arthur leaves Camelot to confront Lancelot, he leaves Mordred in charge. Mordred takes advantage of Arthur's absence and seizes the throne. When the betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere came out in the open, King Arthur was heartbroken. While he had been warned by Merlin of their betrayal in his early years, it still cut him to the core. The Battle of Camlan, King Arthur's final battle. There he will face the notorious traitor Mordred. Neither will survive this battle. King Arthur, being mortally wounded, is taken off to the Isle of Avalon by Merlin. Once there, it is unsure whether his wounds are healed. All that is left is a sea, promising King Arthur's return to save Britannia.